Copper Sun by Sharon Draper, Chapter 5, The Door of No Return. One day, Amari and the other women were taken from the cell in small groups. Cold water from large wooden buckets were tossed upon them. Their clothes, what little that remained, were torn and barely covered their bodies. The soldiers who guarded them liked to rip the tops of the women's garments so their breasts were exposed. Amari learned to swallow her shame. The women who had befriended her was called Afi. She made sure Amari had food each day and protected her from some of the other women who had grown fierce and violent in their captivity. She showed Amari how to walk with a limp and look with a vacant, stupid stare to make sure the soldiers would pass her by when they looked for women to come to their rooms. She also showed Amari how to exercise inside the cell to stay strong and ready for whatever may come next. At night, she crooned soft songs similar to the ones Amari's mother had once sang to her as a child. Afi told Amari that her husband and a daughter about Amari's age had died 2 years before. Amari figured that Afi needed her as much as she needed Afi. "Do you think the ancestors can speak to us in this place?" Amari asked Afi one hot night. The air was thick with the stench of excrement. "I don't know, child," she replied, trying to cool Amari by fanning her with her hand. "I know they see us, however, and they weep for us. I can feel it." "We need more than weeping," Afi said quietly. "We need an army of warriors to come and unfasten the locks, kill our captors, return us to our homes, and bring our families and friends back to us, alive and smiling." "You know that is not to be, my child," Afi replied gently. "We are caught in a place where there is no hope, no escape from the misery of the present or the memories of the past." They were silent then, for there was nothing more to say. One day, without warning, Amari and the rest of the women were brought into the center of the prison by the white soldiers, who chained their hands behind them and shackled their feet as well. These strange white men, one of them so tall and thin that he seemed to sway when he walked, looked over each of the women as if inspecting goats for slaughter. The thin man came up to Amari and lifted her upper lip, pinching the flesh in his long, bony fingers. He smelled unwashed. Amari whipped her head away from him, his eyes dark with anger. Glaring at her, he slapped her face so hard she almost fell to the ground. Then he yanked her back up, grabbed her chin, and held it tightly while he pulled her at her lip again. "Open your mouth," Afi hissed at her. Terrified, Amari did so. The tall man took his time inspecting the inside of her mouth. He ran his fingers along her teeth and gums, mumbling to himself as he did so. When he was satisfied with his inspection of her, he moved on to the next woman. Amari stood close to Afi, shivering with fear and disgust at the rough hands of each of the white men examined and prodded her arms, thighs, calves, and breasts. The men yelled and spoke very fast in their strange language. Amari heard the word price many times. Finally, they seemed to come to a settlement. Cowrie shells were counted and passed from the trader with the willowy body to the men who had captured them. Amari saw cloth also being exchanged and jewelry and gold. They had very little need of gold in her village, but she knew what it was. She knew it held the value of her life. One by one, the women were taken through the door that Afi had spoken of earlier. She screamed, some fought back, and some screamed, some fought back and had to be pushed. The door was narrow and very low to the ground. No one could stand upright and pass through it. The only way to go through the passageway was to crawl. A soldier grabbed Amari roughly and pushed her toward that door. He forced her to the ground and then kicked her in the direction of the passageway. She had no choice but to proceed. It was difficult with chains on, but she managed to crawl painfully and slowly. The walls were smooth and worn, as if many bodies had passed through that narrow, low tunnel. At the end of the passage, a pair of hands pulled her up and she had to close her eyes to the brightness of the sun. When she could finally open them, she saw that beautiful white sand lay in front of her. The salty smell that she had grown accustomed to was now overwhelming. As her eyes adjusted to the light, Amari cast her eyes for the first time upon the ocean. Travelers had occasionally come to her village, so she had heard tales of the blueness and vastness of the ocean. But nothing could have prepared her for the water so blue, so beautiful, so never ending. After so many days of the darkness of her cell, the glory of that view was powerful and very, very frightening. Would she be thrown into the sea? And what was that strange house in the distance that seemed to rest on the surface of the water? It could not be a boat. Boats were small and held one or two people. Boats were used for fishing or visiting family members downriver. This was huge, with white fabric dancing from it. That could not be a boat, Amari decided. It must be a place of the dead. Before she had a chance to absorb it all, a man dragged her to what looked like a goat pen. A fire burned brightly in the center of it, even though the day was very warm, and the man was steering her toward it. Amari realized with fear, "Am I going to be cooked and eaten now? Why couldn't I have died with my family?" she thought wildly. Panicked, she tried to pull away from the man, but his grip only tightened. A black man who spoke the language of the white men pushed her roughly down into the sand and held her firmly so she could not move. Amari could see only the feet of the second man, but he moved toward the fire, leaned down to pick something up, then walked purposefully toward her. Intense, fiery pain pierced the sweaty softness of her skin above her left shoulder. Amari could hear her flesh sizzle, and she nearly fainted as she realized she was being branded. Like a wounded animal, Amari screamed and screamed. "Why?" was the only thought that in her head. Someone then pulled her away from the fire, smeared a horrible smelling salve on her wound, and yanked her over to another holding pen full of prisoners like her, all dazed from the pain of the hot branding iron. Many of them sat hunched over, trying to nurse their wounds. A few stared at the pale blue sky, the deep blue of the unbelievable expanse of water, and the death house that tossed in the waves in the distance. The salve must have been effective, for the intense pain gradually subsided and was replaced by a duller throbbing that would not go away. Amari saw then that Afi had emerged from the prison as well. When she was branded, she did not cry out. Amari could see the pain on her face and the tears rolled down her cheeks, but Afi did not utter a sound. Afi was thrown into the holding pen soon after that, and they hugged each other gently, avoiding the fiery sores on their shoulders. "What happens now?" Amari whispered. "Child, I've heard stories, but I've never seen the ocean before. I have heard that the water spills over the edge of the world and that only death is found there." "There has to be something on the other side of the great water," Amari reasoned. "The white soldiers had to come from whatever that place is." "It must be a place of death for sure," Afi replied, agreeing with Amari, "for only such a horrible place could create such creatures who could burn a person with a flaming hot iron." Amari started to remind her that they had been held down by people of their own land, people who looked just like them, but at that moment several men were shoved into the holding cell. 3 of them were some of the very same Ashanti warriors who had helped to capture the people from her village. They looked stunned at their sudden change in status. Another new captive, who looked positively irate, was a black man who had just held Amari down on the sand while she was branded. He held his freshly branded shoulder and called out in the language of the whites, but they ignored him. The last man to be tossed in the pen was Besa. The men had been kept from the women, housed in a separate section of the prison. Amari had not seen Besa since they had arrived. He was thin and filthy and looked absolutely beautiful to her. She wanted to call out his name, run to him and hug him, but she found she could say nothing as he was taken to the far corner of the holding pen and chained there. Besa looked up and gazed directly at Amari for just a moment. His face, once so proud and happy, showed only defeat. She understood. The pen offered no shelter from the intense heat of the day. No water was offered to them. Men in uniform and men with obvious power and authority strode across the sand all afternoon, clearly preparing for something. But what? Amari wondered. Then several of them climbed into a small boat that rocked and tossed in the waves of the large water, and they rowed out to the floating house in the distance. The boat returned with more men in uniform and a load of heavy chains. Amari knew they were for them. The sunset that evening was unlike any Amari had ever seen. The spirit of the copper sun seemed to bleed for them as it glowed bright red against the deepening blue of the great water. It sank slowly, as if saying farewell. The shadows deepened and darkness covered the beach. As night fell, the leader of the captors ordered small fires to be made on the beach, and Amari soon smelled the welcome odor of food cooking. It had been a long time since they had been given anything to eat, and she was amazed when the holding pen was opened and generous portions of water and food, fresh fruit, Boiled cassava and some kind of fish stew were distributed to them. Nobody questioned the offering, and the food was consumed greedily and quickly. Licking her fingers, she asked Afi, "Why do they feed us so well tonight?" "To prepare us for the journey, I believe." "What journey?" Afi hesitated. "Tell me," Amari urged. "We will be taken to the boat of death on the horizon, and we will never see this place again." Her voice chilled Amari even more than the brisk wind that blew off the ocean. "I do not understand." "We are slaves, Amari, slaves." "I know this." Amari knew, of course, what slaves were. Some of the wealthier elders in her own village had a few slaves. They had been won in battle or traded in negotiations between villages and tribes. They were usually respected and sometimes even adopted as extended members of a family. "But this is not like anything we've ever known, is it?" Amari asked her. She braced herself for Afi's answer. "No, child. Horrors unimagined, I feel, will assault us." Amari thought back to the night she was captured and the journey to this place. Her mind could not imagine worse. She shivered in the night air, the brand on her shoulder throbbing. She thought of Quasi, the little bird who would never fly again, but in a way, she was glad he would not have to endure any of these horrors. Finally, leaning against the pole she was tied to, she managed to fall asleep.